A wealthy rancher turned away every pretty bride until he chose the quiet Chinese cook. Elias Whitmore stood at the edge of the long oak table, while three beautifully dressed brides sat across from him beneath the late afternoon light, their dresses bright as polished porcelain, their laughter carefully rehearsed, and the entire ranch house watching as if the outcome were already decided. Mrs. Dalton folded her hands expectantly. "They've traveled far," she reminded him gently. The first bride smiled wide and said, "Your ranch is magnificent, Mr. Whitmore." The second added, "And your home deserves a proper lady." The third leaned forward slightly. "A wealthy man shouldn't dine alone." Elias listened without interruption, fingers resting lightly on the table's edge. Outside, ranch hands slowed their work to watch through open windows. Inside, anticipation thickened. Finally, he spoke calmly. "I appreciate the effort." The brides straightened. "But I won't be marrying any of you." The words landed clean and unraised. A ripple moved through the room. Mrs. Dalton blinked. "Surely one of them—" "No," he repeated, not harsh, simply firm. One bride's smile stiffened. "May I ask why?" Elias glanced towards the window, where late sun cast long shadows across the yard. "Because I'm not looking for brightness," he said evenly. A soft gasp slipped from the corner of the room. "Then what exactly are you waiting for?" the third bride asked, her tone no longer sweet. In the quiet that followed, porcelain clinked faintly. Mei Lin Zhao stood near the sideboard holding a silver tray, her head lowered as she poured tea with steady hands. She had not spoken once. She had not looked up. Elias's gaze moved slowly across the table and past the dresses, past the jewels, until it rested on the small figure near the wall. Mei Lin felt it before she saw it. Her hands paused mid-pour. A drop of tea slipped over the rim and touched the tray. She looked up, just slightly. The room followed his line of sight. For a second, no one breathed. Mrs. Dalton frowned. "Surely you're not suggesting—" Elias stepped back from the table. "I'm suggesting," he said calmly, "that I know what I'm looking at." The brides stiffened. Mei Lin lowered her gaze again, but not before the entire room saw the faint color rise in her cheeks. Outside, the ranch hands had stopped working altogether. And for the first time that afternoon, the silence did not belong to the brides. It belonged to the cook. Mei Lin kept her head lowered the next morning, though she felt the weight of eyes following her from the porch to the kitchen door. And by midday, the entire ranch knew that Elias Whitmore had refused 3 polished brides and looked instead toward the quiet cook who measured flour without waste and spoke only when necessary. The gossip reached her before breakfast ended. "He only glanced her way," one ranch hand muttered near the stove. "Doesn't mean anything." Another replied, "Then why'd he refuse all 3? Mei Lin continued kneading dough as if the words were wind. Outside, Mrs. Dalton cornered Elias near the stable. "You embarrassed them," she said sharply. Elias tightened a saddle strap with controlled force. "I was honest." "You were foolish," she corrected. "Do you truly think that girl belongs beside you?" Elias paused, then resumed fastening the buckle. "I think I know what steadiness looks like." Mrs. Dalton scoffed softly and walked away. By noon, the rejected brides had not yet left the property. They gathered near the well, their dresses bright against the dust. One of them stepped into the kitchen doorway just as Mei Lin finished stitching a tear along Elias's work shirt. "Careful with that," the bride said lightly. "You wouldn't want to ruin something valuable." Mei Lin did not look up. "It won't tear again," she replied softly. The bride leaned against the doorframe. "Men notice beauty first," she said, "not threadwork." Mei Lin tied the final knot and smoothed the fabric flat. "Cloth that tears easily doesn't last long," she answered. The bride's smile faltered slightly. Later, Elias entered the kitchen quietly. He lifted the repaired shirt and examined the seam. "You missed a stitch," he said. Mei Lin met his eyes briefly, calm and steady. "No, sir," she replied. "I reinforced it." He ran his thumb along the line again, then nodded once. "You did." Outside, laughter rose from the porch, but inside the kitchen something quieter shifted. He set the shirt down carefully instead of tossing it aside. "How long have you been accounting the pantry inventory?" he asked without preface. Mei Lin hesitated. "Since I noticed the numbers didn't match." Elias studied her. "They match now." She lowered her gaze again. "Yes, sir." For the first time that day, the silence in the kitchen did not feel heavy. It felt deliberate. The sky darkened faster than expected that afternoon, wind bending the tall grass flat against the earth, while ranch hands rushed to secure loose equipment before the storm hit full force. And inside the house, the rejected brides gathered near the windows, skirts lifted slightly away from dust as they commented nervously about the weather. "Does it always turn this quickly?" one asked. Elias stepped onto the porch, eyes scanning the fence line beyond the lower pasture where feed sacks lay stacked near the open shed. "It does when you ignore the clouds," he replied calmly. Thunder cracked across the horizon. The first hard gust scattered loose straw through the yard. Before Elias could move, a small figure slipped past him and down the steps. Mei Lin ran straight toward the feed sacks as rain began to fall in sharp, slanted sheets. One of the brides gasped. "Where is she going?" Another answered, "She'll ruin that dress." But Mei Lin did not hesitate. She crouched beside the sacks and began dragging them beneath the partial cover of the shed, her small frame bracing against wind that nearly lifted the fabric from her shoulders. Elias followed without speaking. Together they secured the final stack just as the rain intensified, soaking them both within seconds. A loose shutter slammed violently against the house. Inside, the brides stepped further back from the windows. "Someone should bring her inside," one murmured, though she did not move. Elias pulled a heavy rope tight across the shed post, while Mei Lin held it steady against the gusts. The wind roared, and for a brief second she lost her footing, but she did not scream. She adjusted her stance and leaned forward again. When the last knot was secured, Elias removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders without ceremony. She looked up at him, surprised but composed. "You'll get wet," she said softly. "I already am," he answered. From the porch, Mrs. Dalton watched in silence. The brides were no longer laughing. As thunder rolled again and rain poured across the yard, the contrast was no longer between beauty and plainness. It was between who stood in the storm and who watched it from behind glass. And Elias saw it clearly. By evening, the storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and the ranch house lit warm with lantern glow, and Mrs. Dalton insisted the rejected brides remain for one final dinner to preserve dignity, though the tension at the long table felt anything but dignified. The women wore fresh dresses as if nothing had happened, though damp hems betrayed how little they had stepped outdoors. Mei Lin moved quietly between chairs, placing plates with precise care, her expression neutral, posture straight despite the whispers that followed her path. "The cook runs fast in the rain," one bride said lightly as Elias took his seat. Another added, "Loyal help is useful." A soft laugh circled the table. Elias unfolded his napkin without comment. When Mei Lin set his plate before him, the third bride leaned forward and said just loud enough, "Does she even understand what we're saying?" The room stilled. Meen did not pause. Yes, she replied evenly, her voice soft but unmistakable. The bride's smile faltered. Mrs. Dalton cleared her throat. We are simply discussing refinement, she said carefully. A ranch of this stature requires presence. Elias looked up slowly. Presence, he repeated. Is that what you call it? The bride straightened. A wife must represent her husband properly. Elias rested his hands on the table. Properly, he said again, calm but firm, is standing in a storm when feed could be lost. Properly is knowing inventory better than my foreman. Properly is not flinching when wind hits. Silence deepened. Meen stood near the sideboard, not looking at him, not expecting defense. One bride scoffed quietly. Surely you don't intend to elevate help to equal standing. Elias pushed his chair back slowly. The sound echoed against the wood floor. She will sit, he said simply. Gasps followed. Mrs. Dalton whispered sharply, Elias! But he had already moved. He pulled an empty chair away from the wall and placed it at the table beside his own. Every eye in the room turned toward Meen. She hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. Her hands were steady as she sat. No triumph, no embarrassment, just quiet composure. The brides stared. For the first time that evening, the space beside Elias was not reserved for ornament. It was occupied by steadiness. Meen rose before sunrise the next morning, as she always did, though the previous night's dinner still echoed faintly through the house in the form of restrained silence and unspoken tension. She moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, measuring flour, setting water to boil, and reviewing the small ledger she had begun keeping quietly for weeks. By mid-morning, Elias entered the kitchen carrying the ranch's official account book, its edges worn and pages unevenly marked. "Walk with me," he said. She followed him to the long work table near the window, where light fell clearly across paper. He opened the ledger and turned it toward her. "My foreman says feed costs are rising," he said, "but I've seen the same numbers twice." Meen studied the entries carefully, scanning columns without touching the page at first. "You're paying for excess grain," she said softly. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Excess?" She nodded. "The deliveries increased after the last drought, but your herd count didn't." She pointed to a narrow column near the margin. "The totals are copied forward without recalculation." Elias leaned closer. "How long have you been watching this?" "Since the third week I arrived," she answered. "I didn't speak because it wasn't my place." He closed the ledger slowly. "It is now." At that moment, two of the brides entered the kitchen corridor, voices drifting ahead of them. "He embarrassed us," one whispered, "and for a cook." They stopped when they saw Elias and Meen standing over the open ledger. Elias turned the book around, so the numbers faced the room. "The ranch has been overspending," he said evenly. "Miss Zhao corrected it." Silence followed. One bride forced a thin smile. "Surely anyone could tally figures." Meen responded without looking up. "Anyone who checks them," she said calmly. Elias shut the ledger with finality. "You belong at that table," he told her, not loudly but with unmistakable certainty. The words settled differently than they had the night before. This was not defense. It was recognition. And as the brides watched from the doorway, the shift became clearer. The quiet cook was no longer background. She was becoming indispensable. The whisper began in the yard before it reached the house. By afternoon, it had shape and direction. One of the rejected brides lingered near the stable long enough for two ranch hands to overhear her remark. "Men like him don't suddenly admire help," she said coolly, "unless the help makes it convenient." The words traveled faster than the wind had the day before. By evening, even the kitchen air felt heavier. Mei Lin sensed it in the pauses between footsteps, in the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. She continued her work without comment, but the shift was no longer subtle. Near sunset, Mrs. Dalton confronted Elias on the porch. "The town is talking," she warned. "Let them," he replied calmly. "They're saying she's positioning herself." Elias didn't respond immediately. He looked out over the pasture instead. "She never once stepped forward," he said quietly. "I did." Inside, Mei Lin folded linens with precise care. She had heard enough. When the house grew quiet, she returned to her small room at the back of the corridor and opened the wooden trunk at the foot of her bed. She placed her ledger notes inside first, then the apron, then the spare dress. She packed carefully. No anger, no tears, just decision. At dawn, the kitchen fire did not light. Elias noticed immediately. The stove sat cold. The morning bread was untouched. He moved down the corridor and stopped at her door. It was open. The trunk was gone. Outside, hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance toward the main road. Elias stepped onto the porch and saw the wagon trail in fresh dust. Mrs. Dalton appeared behind him. "Perhaps this is for the best," she said. He didn't answer. He reached for his coat and mounted without another word. The ranch hands watched in silence as he rode toward town. For the first time since refusing the brides, his expression was not calm, it was certain. And in the kitchen doorway, the absence felt louder than any rumor. The town square was already awake when Mei Lin stepped down from the small eastbound wagon, her trunk placed carefully beside her feet, while the driver adjusted the reins. And though she stood still, she did not look back toward the ranch road. A few townspeople pretended not to watch. Others did not pretend at all. Word had traveled faster than she had. "Leaving so soon?" one woman murmured near the mercantile door. Mei Lin folded her hands in front of her apron. "My work is finished," she said softly. The wagon driver cleared his throat. "Train'll pass before noon," he reminded her. Just then, the distant sound of hooves broke through the morning air. Heads turned. Elias Whitmore rode into the square without slowing, dust rising behind him as he dismounted in one smooth motion. The watching crowd parted instinctively. He stopped directly in front of her. For a moment, neither spoke. "You left before breakfast," he said calmly. Mei Lin kept her gaze lowered. "It seemed appropriate." A murmur moved through the square. One of the rejected brides stood near the well, arms folded, waiting. Elias stepped closer, but not too close. "You're leaving because they're loud," he said evenly. She shook her head once. "I'm leaving because I understand my place." His jaw tightened slightly. "Your place is not decided by them." The square fell quiet. The wagon driver shifted impatiently. "Sir, I've a schedule." Elias didn't take his eyes off her. "If you want to go," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I won't stop you." A pause. "But don't leave because someone else measured you wrong." Slowly he extended his hand. Not commanding, not urgent, just open. The crowd leaned forward as if the answer belonged to them. Mei Lin looked at his hand, then at the watching faces, then back at him. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because I chose you," he replied, just as quietly. The rejected bride scoffed under her breath, but no one echoed her. The silence held. Mei Lin's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her trunk, and for the first time since stepping off the ranch property, she hesitated. The square slowly resumed its breathing as the wagon driver stepped back to give them space, though no one truly moved away, and Mei Lin remained still beside her trunk, while Elias kept his hand extended between them. Not impatient, not pleading, simply steady. After a long moment, she spoke. "You turned away beauty," she said quietly. "Why?" The question was not accusation. It was uncertainty. Elias lowered his hand, but did not step back. "Because brightness fades," he answered, "and I wasn't looking for something that shines only when it's watched." A faint ripple moved through the crowd. Mei-Lin finally lifted her eyes fully to meet his. "And what were you looking for?" she asked. His expression did not shift. "Someone who stands in the rain without asking who's watching." The memory of the storm hung between them. Someone who sees numbers where others see decoration. Someone who does not step forward for attention. His voice remained calm. Someone steady. Mei-Lin's fingers loosened from the trunk handle. "You don't know what that costs," she said softly. "I do," he replied. "It costs being overlooked." A small silence followed. One of the townsmen near the well cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the intimacy unfolding in public. "You could have chosen easier," she continued. Elias allowed himself a faint breath. "I don't measure my life by ease." The wagon driver shifted again. "Miss?" he prompted gently. Mei-Lin glanced toward the road that led east, then toward the ranch road behind Elias. "If I stay," she said carefully, "it will not be because you rescued me." "I didn't," he answered. "I asked." Another pause. "And if I leave?" she asked. "Then I'll know you chose it," he said simply. No promises, no dramatic declarations, just certainty. The weight of the square seemed to dissolve into something quieter, anticipation without cruelty. Mei-Lin stepped forward half a pace, closing the distance between them. She did not take his hand yet, but she did not turn away either. And that, for the first time, felt like movement. The silence in the square stretched thin as Mei-Lin stood between two roads, the one leading east toward a quiet disappearance, and the one leading back to a ranch that had not yet fully accepted her. And Elias did not move to close the space, though every eye in town seemed to lean forward. The rejected bride near the well spoke first, her tone cool. "You don't truly believe this will last," she said. "Men like him don't stay fascinated with novelty." A few uneasy nods followed. Mei-Lin's posture straightened. "I am not novelty," she replied softly. Elias's gaze never left her. "No," he said calmly. "You are not." He stepped past the murmuring crowd and stopped directly beside her, placing himself between her and the well without aggression, just alignment. Mrs. Dalton stepped forward hesitantly. "Elias, think carefully. Marriage is presentation." He shook his head once. "Marriage is partnership." The word carried. A ranch hand near the general store muttered, "He's serious." Elias finally extended his hand again, not toward the crowd, not toward the argument, only toward her. "Will you stand with me?" he asked, his voice steady and clear enough for all to hear. The question did not carry ownership. It carried invitation. Mei-Lin studied his face for a long moment, measuring not his wealth, not his reputation, but his consistency. He had not flinched at the table. He had not raised his voice in the storm. He had not chased her with anger. He had asked. Slowly she placed her hand in his. Not timid, not dramatic, certain. A visible shift passed through the crowd. Not applause, not protest, just recalibration. The rejected bride looked away first. Mrs. Dalton exhaled softly. Elias closed his fingers gently around Mei-Lin's hand and turned toward the ranch road without announcing anything further. The wagon driver clicked his tongue and moved on. The square resumed its rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. The choice had been made publicly, without spectacle. And this time, it was not beauty the town watched walk away. It was doubt. The wedding was not announced with banners, nor did Mrs. Dalton arrange a spectacle to restore her pride. It took place on the ranch porch beneath clear morning light, with only a handful of townspeople present, those who came not to judge, but to witness. Mei Lin wore a simple cream dress, modest and unadorned, her dark braid resting neatly over one shoulder. Elias stood beside her in his usual coat, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone. The officiant spoke plainly. No elaborate vows were required. When asked if she would stand with him, Mei Lin answered without hesitation. When asked if he would take her as his wife, Elias did not glance toward the crowd. "I already did," he said quietly. A few murmurs followed, but they carried no sharpness this time. The rejected brides were not present. Mrs. Dalton stood near the steps, her expression measured but no longer resistant. After the brief ceremony, Elias did not lift Mei Lin in theatrical fashion or draw attention with grand gestures. Instead, he walked beside her toward the yard where ranch hands had resumed ordinary tasks. One of them nodded respectfully as they passed. "Ma'am," he said. Mei Lin returned the nod evenly. Later that afternoon, she stood once more in the kitchen, reviewing the ledger she had corrected weeks earlier. Elias entered and leaned against the doorway. "You could have chosen easier," she said softly, echoing her words from the square. He crossed the room and rested a hand over hers where it lay on the page. "I didn't want easier," he replied. She studied him for a moment. "You weren't waiting for beauty," she said. "No," he answered. "I was waiting for steadiness." Outside, wind moved gently through the pasture, bending grass but not breaking it. The ranch house felt unchanged in structure, but different in weight. No longer arranged for presentation, it now held partnership. And as evening settled quietly over the land, the wealthy rancher who had turned away every pretty bride stood beside the woman he had chosen. Not because she shimmered, but because she remained. He turned away beauty without hesitation. Would you have had the courage to choose steadiness instead? If you enjoy frontier love stories about dignity, quiet strength, and powerful choices, subscribe Native American Tales for more Western stories.